Greetings and welcome to the podcast series at the College of Education and Integrative Studies at Cal Poly Pomona. My name is Jeff Pass. I'm the Dean of the college, and we have as our special guest today Dr. Liane Hypolite from our Department of Educational Leadership. Welcome, Liana.
Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to hear from you. Liana is our newest faculty, one of our newest faculty members, coming to us from her doctoral program and bringing a little bit of expertise in areas that we're happy to include in our offerings. Liana, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background as a educator and as a scholar?
Sure. So thank you again, Dean Pass, for having me. I'm really excited to join the faculty at Cal Poly. And in terms of my prior experience, I actually come from the world of college access and success. So my first job out of college after volunteering as a tour guide and working in operations and getting close to the admissions process as a student was actually to go work for an education nonprofit where I helped students who were attending Boston Public Schools, which is the area where I'm from, both apply to college. And then we also had students who were currently in college that we were supporting with the advising aspect in terms of picking classes and selecting a major, submitting financial aid every year, which was always a shocker to students that they didn't just have to do it their senior year of high school, but every year following. And so that's some really good work that I was able to do with young people for a few years at a national nonprofit called Bottom Line. And then after getting my master's degree, I worked as the Dean of College and Career Advising for a small charter high school in the Boston area as well. And it was really in that work of doing direct service with students and families that I would say that I got some insight into schools beyond my own personal experiences and really had the power and the independence to do school differently and work in an environment of educators who also believed in educational equity. And so I would say that that was another big pivotal moment in my professional experience and what informs the work that I do now.
So let's talk about this term equity. It has different meanings for different people. How does it apply to education, and what kind of experiences do you have that informed your interest in the topic?
Sure. So equity is a really, really important topic. And I often start off with talking to people about why there's a difference between equality and equity. And I think that what that means for education is that what we've seen because of historical policies and also the ways that our society continues to be segmented, especially along the lines of race and class, is that we have many concentrated areas of poverty and historical communities that have not been resourced adequately. And so what that means is that we have a lot of schools that have many of our students who need the most from us. So students who require academic supports and social and emotional supports, financial supports. And when we put all of our young people who need so much from us as educators into one school building, it means that it exacerbates a lot of the challenges that our young people and their families are experiencing. And I would say that that was a big part of my experience as a dean previously within a charter school that was serving individuals from the area, was that we were often just feeling like we were spread too thin. We were trying to provide a lot of full service support. So not just be a space of academics, but understanding that if a young person is hungry and they come to class, there's no way that they're ready to engage with academics. And having a school social worker and having many of these supports in place and still feeling like we were missing the boat in many cases and not able to provide our students with everything that they needed. And I would say that when I think about educational equity, I think of our most minoritized students. So our students who are not just facing academic challenges, but are also seeing a series of other ways in their lives in which our government and our systems have not supported them and their families for generations. And so equity really means to me pivoting our best resources towards our young people and our communities that need us the most.
So some would say that there are already school funding formulas in place to address those differences. Are you saying that they're not sufficient?
Yeah, and I think that a big part of why they're insufficient is that we continue to fund many of our school systems based on property taxes. And so, if we continue to see even bigger wealth disparities, which we're seeing in the era of COVID, that it's creating even bigger disparities in our economic stratification, then that's something that's going to continue to be an issue for our schools and for our young people.
So what do you see as a solution to address this inequity? Would it be simply a matter of state funding as opposed to property tax based?
So I think it would be a combination of state and federal forces, which is a lot to think of in this moment of time. Thinking about redistribution in our economic policies. And while maybe a few years ago that would have been a really crazy thought and idea to bring to the table, I think that we saw with some of our more progressive candidates for president that there are some options and some policies that are on the table, even thinking about policies like the Green New Deal and some of our lawmakers who are actually willing to do things that have not been done before and consider education as a right. Which I think has not been the case. It's in many ways, and it's been treated as if it's a privilege, and our most privileged in society have had access to quality education, and we haven't provided that to many of our communities for a long time. And so I think we have to be very creative and think about redistribution of wealth when we think about educational policies and how to make our schools more equity oriented in the ways that they're funded.
So it would seem to me then that much of the discussion about education looks at school districts or even individual schools and calls them failing or successful. But you're saying that it's really a deeper issue. It's a societal, it's about housing, it's about food distribution, it's about employment and health.
Absolutely, Dean Path. And what I would say is, even when I was thinking about my own educational journey, I had a lot of issues selecting a PhD program because I felt like, sure, my love and my passion is in education, but I see how all of these other issues are interconnected to education. And coming from a sociology background as well, it was really hard to kind of parse out what is it that schools have within their realm of control in terms of their abilities to make deep and long lasting changes in the lives of our students and families. And what are the ways that we have to work together with other elements of society outside of our school buildings to really make change for our young people. And I learned that even myself, that as an educator and in my college counseling roles, I had to have partnerships with people who were going to potentially employ my young people once they graduated and got their degrees. And just the ability to have access to work and income meant so much for the youth that I worked with as well. So we can't see these issues as siloed. They're all interconnected. That's the life of a person, like it is for all of us. And so we have to understand that schools and school buildings can only do so much, and they can do even more when they work in unison with the local community and progressive initiatives that are happening.
So I guess you would agree that it would behoove educators to be politically active, since outside the school building, so many of the policies are determined.
In my opinion, yes. And I think that that's an especially controversial conversation as we're seeing our current president have some opinions about ideas like critical race theory, concepts around ethnic studies. And we know now that that is an expectation for our students in the Cal State system. That's an especially important area for us to learn about and to be connected to. And again, those topics are not happening in silos. We have to be a part of the movement building that is happening right now and work with our community organizers and with our young people who are also community organizing. They're a part of this movement. And if we're not paying attention to what they're asking for and what they're demanding in many cases, then I think it's really going to stunt the ability of education to actually become a space that can change someone's future. I think that's been the rhetoric for a very long time, and I'm not sure how long that's been true, or if it's ever been true for our most minoritized communities. But for us to make that a reality, for education to be a space that can foster real change and generational change, we have to work in unison with our organizers and with our partners who are in the movement.
Yeah. So that might have been happening in some regions to some degree, but it all got blown up when COVID came along, and that uncovered new kinds of inequity that some of us knew about, but the digital divide is one of them.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm actually teaching a course this semester to our doctoral students, and we're talking about leading and learning in the age of technology. And a big part of our course, the way that we started off our course, was talking about the digital divide. Which is essentially saying that not only do we have a divide, which many of us have seen on the news when you see young people sitting outside of a McDonald's or Starbucks trying to do their schoolwork. So we see it's not just an issue of access to a laptop, a tablet, the internet, but it's also about the skill sets that our students don't always have when it comes to using digital technology in ways that support academic learning. So I was having a conversation with one of my students just this week. We're coming up with research projects for the semester. And the idea is that not only is it providing some insight into the digital divide, but it's also reflecting on the COVID pandemic and the impact that it's had on these issues. And my student was talking about how her own students in the classroom and how they're always on their phone and they seem so savvy, but do we really understand their savviness? Do we know the ways in which it can support and advance their learning in the classroom? And maybe those are things we need to tap into as educators, or are there real gaps in understanding, and how can we help support them with addressing those gaps in terms of their technology abilities and skill sets? So I think there's a lot for us to figure out and a lot for us to learn from our young people about how we can meet them where they are and bring education at this time where we can innovate. Because of the fact that we're being forced to, how can we really meet them where they are so that we can address some of these challenges as we see these divides and these gaps really widen during this pandemic?
So if we see a young person who's adept with his or her cell phone, they might be really good at posting a photo on Instagram or tweeting something clever, but we don't really know about their skills in finding valid and reliable information and comparing that to other sources and all of those basic skills of the internet age.
Absolutely. And as we see in the news more and more, that many of these social media sites are connected in different ways to political organizations or being co-opted by different governmental and private sector sources. It's something that we just have to be working with our young people to be able to understand and figure out what is a real and true source of accurate information, and how can I find out when something has been created and falsified. It's a big part of digital learning, and something that we have to learn for ourselves because it's changing so quickly, and then impart that knowledge on our young people as well.
So there are probably some educators that are listening or watching this podcast. What recommendations would you have for, let's say, a high school teacher or a junior high school teacher?
Yeah, so I would say for junior high school, and I would even say into college level, that our educators, I think, should kind of start off with some assessment. How do you figure out where your students are in their digital abilities? So part of that could just be trying to make that deciphering decision about what do you know about social media. I think that we should really plug into social media and use it to our advantage. I know that there are a few courses while I was getting my PhD that were trying to integrate learning into Twitter. What is the conversation that's happening about a given topic on Twitter? So if our young people are already there, how do we again meet them where they are? And then the other piece is how do we do some of the educational experiences if we figure out what those gaps are? So, for example, just like we were speaking about, if it's about determining what are accurate, informative sources versus those that maybe are just put there on purpose to convey a certain message, helping them to really differentiate those sources, I think is something that we'll have to prioritize across all of our classes, not just save it for the classes that are about technology or about these topics, but really integrate it into every single subject matter.
So it's you're in a really good position to start influencing that as a professor in our doctoral program,
Yes.
because you work with a lot of administrators or would-be administrators. How do you see them, educational leaders, carrying this kind of work forward?
Yeah, I think what's been great about working with educational leaders as I've made that pivot away from working directly with students is being able to see how these leaders are influencing their colleagues and their students at scale. So even with our discussion board posts that we use to kind of communicate when we're not together synchronously virtually, they share some of the types of lessons that they might facilitate with their students, the type of data that they may share with their colleagues. And so being able to get that insight into what their day-to-day lives are like as educational leaders who are already practicing many of the elements that you need to advance equity in these spaces has been really, really wonderful to see. And I think that what we hope we can do with our program for our students who are able to join us is to really foster and facilitate those skill sets so they can have an even greater reach over their students, whether they're still in the classroom, because we absolutely believe that many of our educational leaders are working directly with our young people, in addition to supporting their fellow administrators and the educators that they work with if they're in an administrator role. So just being able to see the work that is already being done and so quickly. Our students, are at the front lines when it comes to our space of education, and they are responding to students' needs and trying to adapt. Learning new technologies and ways of communicating and engaging students, whether those are videos or little images they make of themselves so that when students aren't with them and they're working on their homework, they're able to still feel connected to their classroom environment and their community. There's just so much creativity, and it's really been such an opportunity for me as an educator to be able to get some insight into all of these spaces where our students are already making a difference.
So what do you foresee as the result of this remote learning revolution that's taking place? We don't know how long it will continue, but surely there will be some elements of it that persist after we've developed a vaccine and things have gotten back to relative normal.
Yeah, I hope that we'll take some of the good pieces away with us. So something that I've enjoyed is that there have been really great webinars and presenters and professional development series that have been available online. And even if it's live, so many more people are able to attend and participate because they don't have some of those potential barriers of needing to actually get to a place, to travel there, to be able to make it on time. I think we're saving a lot of time for the many of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home. And so being able to see those opportunities and how it brings a lot of people together, I hope that that's something we can hold on to, that we remember that we can do a lot of learning in this virtual space and free ourselves of some of the logistical nightmares that it used to mean to get people together. I know that we'll be so excited to gather together once again, once we're able to with a vaccine present. So I know that the community piece will come back to in place, but I hope that we can, yeah, take some of the conveniences of building virtual communities like we've been able to do and bring that with us.
Yeah. So let's talk about your own teaching. You went through most of your schooling face to face,
Yeah.
and you've taught face to face, and now you're teaching exclusively remotely. Uh, uh, what's that like? What kinds of adaptations have you had to make?
Absolutely. So it definitely was a new experience. And what was really great is having a community of people, including my dad, my sister, so many people in my life who have also had to make this online transition, give me a lot of really great advice. They even let me practice my classes on them ahead of time. I just wanted to make sure that the time that I have with my students, we're not spending too much of it on some of the technical difficulties that can come up. So that's been really helpful to me as an educator, again, is to do some of that practicing with the technology pieces ahead of time. Some of it's inevitable, and I've just learned to accept that there may be little issues that come up. But otherwise, I've really, really enjoyed the synchronous experience with students and being able to see their faces. And what I've found is just that the same way that in person teaching, it's very important to have active pedagogy to make sure that it's as engaging as possible. That's something that is important in the virtual space as well. It is not a space for hours of lecturing and talking at people. That has to feel like something that can be collaborative and still foster learning together. And so polls have been a really cool way for us to do some learning together, present the poll, and then go over what our thinking was together in our collective space. Breakout rooms have been really wonderful, not just for students to do their own independent work, but for them to also collaborate, provide peer feedback to one another in what feels like a virtual safe space, being able to share the questions that they have and also some answers with one another. And then coming back for the full group has been a really good pattern that we've set in our classes together. And then, like I mentioned earlier, doing still individual one-on-one check-ins because we have these smaller classes in our doctoral program, which I think is so wonderful for both my experience as an educator and our students. We've been able to still provide that individualized attention that I appreciate.
So part of your responsibilities as a professor in the educational leadership program is to work on doctoral committees as students are conducting their own individual research. What are some of your observations about the trends that you're seeing among the students in our program?
So I think a really beautiful trend is that our students are asking themselves, what is the so what of my study when it comes to aspiring towards educational equity? So I think whereas perhaps before, and I can't speak to this since I'm new to the department, it was about what topic do I find interesting? What is related to the work that I do on a day-to-day basis? I would say those features are still important, and yet our students are being able to critically examine, well, if I find out the answer to this question, what will it do for our most minoritized or marginalized students or teachers or administrators? They're looking at so many different facets of these questions. And yet, I think coming back to this question of equity, and what it will do to create more opportunity for individuals is something that I see as the crux of a lot of their work, which is wonderful.
So no one's doing research for the sake of research or just to
No.
get over the finish line. They really want to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest issue is that they want to take on these massive
Yeah,
projects. And I think that part of my job, as in the advising capacity and then as a committee member, is to say, okay, how do we also take into consideration that many of you are full-time working people, you're also parents with families and individuals with responsibilities, and how do we take off a chunk of this wonderful goal you've set for yourself that feels really manageable and is just the start to the kind of work that you'll be doing throughout your career?
right. Yeah, I would always tell doctoral students that this is not a book. This is just to show your committee that you are capable of doing the kind of independent thinking and problem solving that you can then carry on throughout your career. So that
Absolutely.
so that makes me, as we wrap up here, what are you working on in your own scholarly endeavors?
Sure. So I actually recently finished my dissertation looking at the experiences of Latinx students who have graduated from a charter high school and are transitioning to a few local universities, trying to understand particularly what it's like for our students who are going from educational spaces where the majority demographic matches their own. So for these students where they go to a majority Latinx high school environment, and then a college experience that is racially very, very different. And so learning a lot about how that transition to college is not just about college readiness that tends to focus on academic preparation, but that there's also a racialized element to that transition too that many of our students are grappling with, and trying to figure out how we could create a curriculum both at the end of the high school experience and the beginning of the college experience that would better support students in managing some of these challenges. Um, and that work actually, I was following a couple of students over time and recently continued to do some check-in interviews with them and learned a lot about how challenging this past spring semester was. That many of them felt like they didn't hear much information from their institution at the time that it was all unraveling, that they were unsure of what to do. Many were told to move out the same day of their from their dorms, and so it was a lot for my students who don't have cars, who live very far away from Los Angeles, where they reside. To It was a very, very challenging time, and also hearing a lot about how they had to make financial decisions that would help their families. So for many of them, the decision to leave their dorm early because they knew that that refund check would be something their parents were going to need, is something I don't think we've really grappled with in this time of COVID. Um, and yet is something that our young people are dealing with and managing, even in making the decision about whether or not to return in person if that was an option for their campus. So I think we have many implications to this pandemic for our young people, and especially, like I've said, throughout our time together, our most minoritized students. We really need to plug in and figure out what it is that they need and how we can get that to our communities on scale. And listen to our students who are very willing to tell us what it is that they would like to see and how they want to be communicated with. For many students, they were just following social media platforms, and that's how they were figuring out what they should do. And I think we just have to have plugged in ways of going where they already are, if that's social media, but also direct connections that make our students feel like they're a part of the decision making process.
Right. So you're definitely adding the student element into the mix, student voices, and that is, uh, I think that's going to attract a lot of positive attention and support. So we are proud as can be to have you on our faculty.
Thank
We look
you.
forward to meeting up with you as time goes on and seeing some of the new developments and the new initiatives that you begin. And thank you for an excellent podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dean Pass.